Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Jerusalem a few hours earlier this week to confer with both Israeli political and intelligence leaders. As usual, he touched upon the joint American-Israeli fight against Iranian aggression, as well as the so-called Trump peace plan and a possible change in the status of parts of the West Bank. How do these issues fit into the broader American strategy for the Middle East, less than 6 months before U.S. elections? To analyze this question, joining our broadcast from elsewhere here in Jerusalem is Mr. Robert Silverman, who is a lecturer at Shalem College and former president of the American Foreign Service Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Jerusalem is Mr. Dan Diker, who is a senior fellow at the Project on Political Warfare at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you.
And here with me in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. I'd like immediately again also here to dive into the program. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments pertaining to U.S. interests in the region, as well as what is the U.S. interest in this region?
Well, Israel celebrated its Independence Day a couple of weeks ago, but if one looks at the calendar, today is actually the first day of independent sovereign Israel back in 1948, which of course was also an election year in the United States, both a presidential and a congressional one. At that time, Secretary of State George Marshall was not so pro-Israel as the current secretary is. But usually what happens in election years is that there is some battle of ideas between the Republicans and the Democrats. And here too, we can see that Donald Trump has a definite idea regarding foreign policy globally, as well as regionally and pertaining to Israel, while Joe Biden, who is most probably going to be anointed the Democratic candidate soon, has a totally different view, which is comparable to what happened during the Obama era, where he served as vice president. So right now, Israel is in the final stages of coming out of its political crisis after a year and a half. The government is yet to make policy, and foreign and national policy was not really the main issue here. Everyone, of course, has been focused on the COVID-19 crisis. The election in the United States is some 5.5 months away. This may not be the best of times to make new decisions regarding policy. So apparently either Secretary Pompeo came here in order to block Israel from doing something hasty in one of its fronts. This has been, of course, the custom of secretaries of state or presidential emissaries such as Philip Habib and others throughout the years. Once they feel that Israel is on the verge of doing something which has not been fully coordinated with the administration, someone rushes over in order, first of all, to forestall anything until he comes. There is the week before he comes. Then there is the visit itself. Then a week after that, Israel cannot do anything for fear that the United States will be seen as having collaborated with whatever Israel is doing. So this is a very known tactic for stalling. But as for the content, we have to wait until midsummer or so to see whether there is anything in the cards for the new Israeli government vis-a-vis the American policy.
Indeed. Mr. Silverman, I'd like to refer the next question to you. When we're talking about the American top diplomat coming here, initially the State Department has stated in its official response to the question of him coming and verifying this fact that the two topics of discussion will be the bilateral cooperation vis-a-vis combating the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the second angle was specifically Iran's malign activities in this region, something that Washington and Jerusalem have been cooperating for a very long time. They see eye to eye on this subject, maybe not specifically on the course of action, but there is a lot of interest pertaining to this. And another aspect that, from what I hear, is a topic of discussion that is ongoing between the Americans and Israelis, the situation in the Sinai Peninsula, where the American force, there have been discussions about maybe pulling out the American force that has been observing and also allowing for the close coordination between Cairo authorities and Jerusalem authorities pertaining to this topic?
Well, there is always on the U.S., thank you, Jonathan, there's always on the U.S.-Israel bilateral agenda a big list of issues. And you just mentioned a number of them. And Israel is the U.S.'s closest ally in this region. And so it's natural that Pompeo would come here and be the real first visitor for this new Israeli government. We coordinate very, very closely on everything in the region, and the region is in trouble right now. I mean, the main U.S. interests in the region, as Amir pointed out, include counterterrorism, and that is the Iran problem, number one. And there's also the issue of maintaining stable oil supply for the world, although the U.S. no longer directly imports from the Middle East. The world prices are directly affected by what happens in the Middle East. And so maintaining stability in the Gulf is very important. And Israel's own security is a very, very top U.S. concern. I think, as Amir noted, that I think the topic of the Trump peace plan may not be formally on the public agenda, but will certainly be discussed. And having worked in Washington on these issues in the Middle East area of the State Department, I can tell you that the Jordanians right now are raising red flags about the Trump peace plan and are urging Americans to take a go slow approach with Israel on plans to extend sovereignty. I think, however, that in the end of the day, this U.S. administration will support an Israeli plan and will work to consult and help Israel consult with allies to make it work.
Indeed. There's been a lot of statements that have been circulating in the media, including reports that were, or interviews that were given by U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, pertaining to the validation of future Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank. He has spoken last weekend, a week ago exactly, about the fact that the United States is willing to recognize about 30% of Israeli annexation over territories that are currently under control of, or not necessarily under control, but the international community up until now have pretty much viewed those territories as Palestinian designated territories for a future state. To what degree do you think that the Americans are concerned about the question of annexation, as we also hear repeatedly in Washington the factor that Jerusalem needs to accept the other parameters pertaining to the Trump peace deal, which also have to do with Israeli freezing of construction in about half of the territories and other aspects pertaining to that?
Jonathan, as always, it's a very important question and requires clarification. The Trump U.S. administration peace plan is a far departure from former failed peace efforts that were sanctioned and many of them initiated and observed by the United States since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 93 and then the interim accords in 1995. The United States' interest is, on the one hand, recognizing Israeli sovereignty in Jewish communities throughout what's called the former West Bank of Jordan, what Israel calls Judea and Samaria, while at the same time staying true to the vision of former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin that talked about defensible borders for Israel, which means allowing Israel to apply Israeli sovereignty to the most strategic parts in the Jordan Valley, which is most of the Jordan Valley, which comprises about 30% of the entire West Bank. And of course, that would give Israel the security requirement of the 4,200-foot rise above the Dead Sea in order to protect the vast majority of its country to the west. That was the strategic requirement that Prime Minister Rabin and his former commander Yigal Allon had required for Israel since 1967. So this American plan really departs from former plans because it looks at the strategic security requirement for Israel, while at the same time trying to bring this ongoing political and diplomatic crisis between Israel and the Palestinians to a closure. There has been really a misunderstanding about what this plan has been about. There is a deep concern, I believe, among the U.S. administration that Israel would be running very quickly on the first part of the plan, while the United States wants an orderly progression, what they call the mapping requirement, to really understand how the borders are going to work. As Mr. Silverman said, they want to make sure that Israel is sticking to its commitment not to build additional housing starts in Area C, the 50% that's to be allotted for a designated Palestinian sovereign entity. So I think that the United States wants to see an orderly progression on the pathway of the U.S. peace plan, while recognizing that Israel should have its rights in this process recognized to annex parts of the West Bank on the existing Jewish housing and communities there.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to continue on the line of security and the cooperation between the United States and Israel on this specific topic, moving to the reports about a partial scale back of Iranian forces in Syria. This was also asked of U.S. Secretary Pompeo during a press briefing about a week ago, when he responded about not too much to add on those reports pertaining to this, but at the same time, he noted that the United States did demand of Iran to scale back. It did relay this policy also to the Damascus regime as well as to Russia. To what degree is the United States and Israel aligned and even cooperating on the ground when it comes to an Iranian scale back from a lot of those strategic areas that pose a threat directly to Israel?
Well, the answer is positive on both counts. They are aligned, they are on the same page, and they are cooperating on the ground too in certain parts of Syria, mostly the eastern or southeastern part of Syria adjacent to the Israeli border, the Jordanian border. And what was remarkable about the comments by either Secretary Pompeo or Ambassador Jeffrey was that the U.S. is resigned and even welcomes the Russians remaining in Syria on one condition, that all the others leave. And the others are the Turks, but mostly the Iranians. Now, what has happened recently is that most of the Iranians and their proxies have redeployed from the area next to the Israeli border because they have been hit by Israel. And Israel, perhaps not so characteristically, has not been shy about these raids and has publicized some of them in order to get some deterrent effect. So the Iranians have gotten the message. They don't want to absorb more casualties. They have taken some of their personnel and equipment out of the Damascus area, which is only 40 kilometers from the Israeli border on the Golan Heights, and moved elsewhere. But up to now, we have talked policy, and one should also talk politics. What is the interest of the Trump administration as they approach the elections? Of course, they would want to get some applause from their political base, the evangelical supporters and others, for recognizing Israeli sovereignty over parts of the Holy Land. But they wouldn't want it to be so blatant as to provoke the Jordanians or the Palestinians or others to start a small war on the eve of the elections. This is not a wise political move on managers of re-election campaigns.
Even though the Iranians openly support the adversary of Trump, Mr. Biden, for president?
Well, this is a separate issue we have seen ever since 1980, when Khomeini supported Reagan and wanted to take revenge on Carter because of the failed rescue attempt some 6 months ahead of the elections, that yes, they can take part in the elections. This also happened to some extent in 1988 in the Iran-Contra affair, where Vice President and then candidate Bush was to some extent involved or implicated in the affair. It didn't hurt him at the end. He did win over Michael Dukakis. But nevertheless, the Iranians can, of course, try to help or hurt one of the candidates. But talking about the Palestinians, there is no real rush right now, after all of these years, to annex the West Bank or the Jordan Valley. It can be declared, but implemented only after the elections.
Indeed. Well, Mr. Diker, I'd like to ask you pertaining to Ambassador Jeffrey or James Jeffrey's latest statement pertaining to Syria and also his activities in order to make sure that U.S. interests are preserved, not only in Turkey, but also vis-a-vis Syria proper. To what degree do you see the American involvement since the declaration of President Trump several months ago about a military pullback still invested in the whole conflict in that country?
Well, Jonathan, both the United States and Israel converge on this issue of Iran in Syria. At the same time, Israel's campaign of maximum military pressure or counterterrorism pressure, according to foreign media reports, Israel has been extremely active in hitting Iranian Revolutionary Guard bases in Syria, and I think that certainly the United States wants to make sure that Israel's national security interests don't destabilize the vital American interests. Let's be very clear. The Americans right now are pursuing a maximum diplomatic pressure campaign against Iran, especially with the upcoming October 24th. The expected ending of the sanctions on conventional weapon sales to Iran that they clearly want to extend. And so they want to make sure that specifically with regard to Israel, and this is one of the major interests between the Secretary of State and the President and Mr. Netanyahu and his co-prime minister or rotational prime minister, General Gantz, want to make sure that they're all on the same page in terms of balancing both countries' very sensitive interests. And that also involves Russia as a sort of an anchor, if you will, both a military and a diplomatic anchor within this very complex construction in Syria.
Mr. Silverman, your take on this?
Yes, I think there's some very good news on the containment of Iran front lately. As others have noted, I'll just stress, of course, the targeted assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January took out the real mastermind. It shows you how, frankly, targeted assassination policy can work from time to time. And without his leadership, Qasem Soleimani, I think the Iranian presence in Lebanon, in other places, Yemen, and also in Syria is in trouble. And then you have the Iranian financial problems owing to the COVID-19. Their economy has been very hard hit. And the U.S. has been at the forefront of maintaining the pressure, as Mr. Diker noted. So there's some good news there. We just have to continue with that pressure. And I think Israel and the U.S. are completely aligned on that. I think going back to the Trump peace plan, I slightly disagree with Amir. I believe that the U.S. administration will support a move before the elections. They've said, because the U.S. has said so publicly, that this is Israel's call. The Trump peace plan, as long as it's done in full consultation with the U.S., and as long as others have noted, complete acceptance of the plan, which includes agreement to negotiate in good faith with the Palestinians on the creation of a Palestinian state. The peace plan allows Israel to annex certain portions to extend its sovereignty. And I think the new Israeli government, which is a broad centrist government, includes left of center like Labor Party as well as right of center and center. So it has a big consensus to do certain steps. And I believe that the U.S. will want to support those steps now to take them as planned, as publicly announced, starting as early as July 1 and before the U.S. elections. I think it's really going to put pressure on the U.S. Democratic Party, frankly. When an Israeli broad consensus takes a step that includes not just the right of center spectrum in Israel, but the center and the center left, I think the pressure will be on the Biden people and their supporters to be a little more nuanced than they have up till now. Because if they're going to be pro-Israel, when 75 to 80% of the Israeli political spectrum takes a consensus step, I think the Democratic Party will want to eventually support that as long as it's done in consultation with our other allies like Jordan. And I think that's what Secretary Pompeo will want to discuss with.
I'd like to ask you one more question pertaining to Turkey in particular. The relations between the United States and Turkey have been very fluctuating over the course of the past several years, several months in particular. I'd like to understand to what degree, now that Turkey has somewhat alienated itself towards Russia, it has put itself in a very difficult position, not only vis-a-vis Israel, which has been ongoing since 2009 and even prior to that, but also vis-a-vis Turkey, the Europeans. It's in a very difficult position, and suddenly we see Ankara sending aid to the United States, trying to somewhat lure the United States into warming once again those relations?
Well, it's a great question, Jonathan. I worked on relations with Turkey as a U.S. diplomat for years. I've served there. It's never been a smooth path. It's always been a very dynamic relationship. But let's look at the strengths there, and there are enduring strengths. Turkey is the second largest supplier of troops to NATO. It's a NATO ally. It maintains an air base in Incirlik, which is critical to U.S. ability to project power and supply efforts in places like Afghanistan. And with all of the difficulties of the current, and it's been there since 2002, so it's been an 18-year a difficult relationship with President Erdogan and the AK party in Turkey. Nevertheless, we find ways to work together because our interests coincide in many places, including on Syria right now, whereby we share an interest with Turkey to get Iran out of there and to prevent the Iranians from maintaining a permanent foothold in Syria. So we find ways to work with Turkey. It's difficult. It's never easy. But that's why U.S. officials get the big dollars to work. That's a little bit of a joke, to work on that difficult relationship.
We're unfortunately drawing near to the end of the program, and there are a lot of topics pertaining to U.S. foreign policy that impact not only the security of the state of Israel, but of this entire region. And I'd like to receive a short analysis of each and every one of you, about 45 seconds to a minute each. Mr. Oren, we'll start with you.
We haven't mentioned Iraq, and of course, Iraq, first in 1991 and then 12 years later, was the cause for U.S. military involvement, which President Trump at first supported, then came out against. He is now firmly against this involvement. He wants to bring the boys home, perhaps for Christmas. He doesn't want Israel to interfere with whatever is happening now in Iraq under the Kadhimi, the new Kadhimi pro-American government. And Israel can now refrain from attacking Iranian shipments because the Iranians have shifted their shipments from the ground, from sending convoys through Iraq to air transport. So on this issue too, Israel is well aligned with the United States.
Mr. Diker?
Jonathan, we need to mention China as a major strategic interest for the United States in the Middle East. This is, we can call this the coronavirus diplomacy tour of Secretary Pompeo. Israel and the United States diverged slightly on China. Israel expected on May 24th to sign a major agreement with the Chinese government on a desalinization project in Israel. Israel, the major desalinization power in the Middle East, the United States deeply concerned about China with regard to the latest pandemic and its role there, as well as a history of what America calls intellectual theft and other malign industrial activities by the Chinese. So Israel's second largest trading partner is China. Of $1.5 billion and 300 Israeli companies. The United States is deeply concerned about Chinese interest in Israeli infrastructure. The powers are Secretary Pompeo, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and rotational Prime Minister Gantz are going to have to discuss this and iron it out.
Well, we'll have to make an entire program about this topic in the near future. Mr. Silverman, last sentence from you.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. I would just add also the mutual interest with Israel in the Gulf, and particularly with Saudi Arabia, where its changes to the oil supply system have rocked the U.S. economy. And so it's a warning and a management issue for both U.S. and Israel, the ever-evolving relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Finally, I would just support what Amir said, that there is more positive news in Iraq with the new Iraqi prime minister, who seems to be less beholden to Iran than his predecessors. And so that is another piece of the Iran containment issue, is a new Iraq prime minister. Thank you.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Mr. Diker, Mr. Silverman, and Mr. Oren for being here with us today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.